Hey guys, so today we're back to, as you can see, it's quite dark again, so here comes another, I don't know, 8 months of complete pitch black darkness. But I have you to keep me company, so I'm not that bothered. Today we are going to define something. We're going to answer a subscriber question, and the question in question was, Fredrik, what do you mean when you talk about enterprise CSS versus, well, whatever there is apart from enterprise CSS? I guess just CSS, right? So that's what we're going to talk about. Now, you may or may not have heard me talk about CSS a few times before, and something that I think we need to touch on, which is the thing that I actually talk to quite a lot of people about. You may know that CSS is quite tricky, just putting it out there. CSS is notoriously hard to master. It's very easy to learn CSS, it's very easy to adopt the principles and understand how it works, but it's very tricky to create the effects that you want and make sure that everything works in every browser, these sorts of things. And one of the things that a lot of people get into their heads is that there is this requirement for them to have CSS skills that are simply beyond what normal application development is about. Now just hear me out on this one. So I'll give you a challenge. If you go to something like, say, CodePen.io, and you go and look at some of the pens, or just search for CSS, something of that nature, then you will find among the popular ones something that catches your eye. You will find some effect or some animation or some pen that really stands out for you. Now, if you go and look at that and you scroll through the code of that CodePen, odds are that you will not understand what that does. It's very likely, unless there are very extensive comments or the thing that you picked is fairly simple, that you will simply not be able to understand what's going on. And you would probably have to reverse engineer quite a bit in order to actually recreate that effect yourself. Maybe it's even beyond your current skill level to create something like that. But I'm just going to give you a secret here. The person who made that, guys, they invested very likely quite a lot of time in order to make that work. Now, what you are looking at, in essence, most likely, is art. I said it, that is art. And I want us to define something for you and me. What is the difference between art and design? Well, I've had quite a few discussions with coworkers, design coworkers specifically, who have this, and I mean, to them it's crystal clear, and to me it's crystal clear, but to some people it's not. You see, when you talk about UX, user experiences, design of that nature, or UI design, there is a big difference between that and the sort of things that you will learn in art school or that artists make, like paintings and so forth and so forth. It's a very different mindset. And the best way I can describe it is that art is meant to give you an emotion. It is meant to make you feel something, while design or UX design is it's a way for you to create clarity, to make something comprehensible or create ease of use without having to, you know, have a manual this thick in order to actually get that. So it's a structured way of creating something. Now, if you have a look at that thing that you were looking at, and you just think back, have you ever seen anything like that on any website before? Most likely you haven't, depending on what caught your eye. But most of us will probably look at something that is quite extraordinary. And that's what I want to talk to you about. You see, that level of CSS has two major flaws. The first thing is that it is all but incomprehensible to anybody except the person who made it. It requires a lot of time and dedication to create something that beautiful. The second thing is that it has almost no practical value. It's beautiful, but it doesn't have a business value. That's why it's on a CodePen and not on a real website. So when I talk about CSS or what I like to call like enterprise or companies. I don't know what to call it, but let's call it enterprise CSS just for the sake of argument. When I talk about that sort of CSS, that's the boilerplate standard everyday CSS that you will write as a professional. The sort of stuff that you see on CodePens is really only applicable in one scenario. It's the only time I know that that level of skill is required in order for you to work with CSS. And that is, drum roll, small-time design firms. That's the only time I've ever seen anybody do that sort of thing in real production software. Because that level of design and skill is something that is more suited to be done by a true professional of design, or an artist, if you will. Somebody who has what I call design skills, web designers. These people who specialize in that, who are more focused on the design aspects and use CSS as a means to achieve these beautiful interfaces, as opposed to a programmer who's building a system. There's a difference in focus, if you will. And it's only at these smaller companies that I see this sort of attention to things. Or of course, if you're in some extremely progressive company. But in general, it's really only on the smaller project that really need, like where you need things to really pop and need things to be extremely impressive, or say demo purposes or expose, stuff of that nature, where you really go that heavy on graphics and design and so forth, because the application you are building is most likely fairly simple, but you still want to make it, you know, something extraordinary. So that's usually how the ratio goes. The bigger the application and the more complex the feature, the less you look at these sorts of things. Now, for everyday programmers who are just working, I can tell you right now that understanding the basics of CSS, and responsive designs, that sort of thing, that is enough to have a job. Because most of the time you are not creating a beautiful animation which has a lot of moving parts and like interacts with mouse clicks and so forth. Most of the time you are making a responsive button. You are making a responsive modal. You are making a responsive tooltip. Something like that. These standard, boring, everyday components, these are the things that you should focus on. These are the things that you will build, not that stuff that you see on CodePen. So what I want you to take away from this, guys, is that when I talk about CSS skills, and when the industry talks about CSS skills, we are not talking about you being an artist that can create something extraordinarily beautiful, unless you are in a bit of a specific field or a specific company. Generally, CSS skills, or knowing when you're ready to actually do CSS professionally, is about two main things. Number one, you need to understand responsive design. You need to be able to create a layout. Number two, you need to understand browser compatibilities. In other words, you have to understand that CSS may behave differently in different browsers. That means that you need to be aware of how to test things and verify things and so forth and so forth. These are just, it's the everyday thing. When it comes to CSS, you may be sold the idea that you have to be an artist, when in reality, most of us who work with CSS are just painters. Have a great day.